Chapter 5. The Self and its Affiliations. We have seen three things in the two preceding papers. That we first become conscious of the ego as part of the act of knowledge, and apparently inseparable from it. 2. That there is a stage of meager false knowledge, connected with the illusion of a separate self. And 3. A stage of full, vastly extended knowledge, connected with the restored sense of union between the ego and the object. We have now to see how far we can get a clearer idea of what we mean by the ego or self. But as a preliminary, we may lay down two propositions, which will be useful later on. Firstly, though we are not conscious of the self except in some act of knowledge or consciousness of an object, and though consequently we cannot think of the self as existing altogether apart from knowledge, we can think of it as going to know or having known, or as potential of knowledge. Thus I think of myself as existing in sleep, as an ego that did know yesterday, or will know tomorrow, or I think of myself as perjuring from one act of knowledge to the next, and so as it were forming a link between the two acts. This does not, of course, prove that I do so exist, and many psychologists argue that this idea is an illusion, and that the ego simply perishes in sleep, or with each act of knowledge, the reappearing ego in each case being an entirely new one. But practically we think as I have indicated, and in fact life being founded on this assumption, of the possibility of the duration of the ego in an unmanifested condition, we accept it, until such time as we find some explanation more adequate and satisfying. Secondly, this thought of the self as antecedently capable or potential of knowledge compels us to think of the knowledge as in some degree dependent on the self. In other words, since knowledge is always relative to the subject in every case contributes something without which the knowledge, at any rate in that form, would not exist. This flows obviously from things that have already been said, and it might seem unnecessary to dwell upon it, but it has important bearings. Practically, the matter is very evident. Not only awakening from sleep do we immediately recognize what the objects around us are, because in fact, we have the memories or images of them already in our minds. But the simplest observation of things involves a similar antecedent condition, the knowing what to look for. How hard to find the cat in the picture, or the woodcock in the autumn leaves, till the precise image of what one wants to see is already in the mind, and then how easy. The townsman walking along the high road perceives not the hare that is quietly watching him from the farther field. Even when the countryman points it out with all circumstance, he fails, because the kind of thing he is to see is not already in his mind. Why is it so difficult to point the constellations to one who has never considered them before? The sky is simply a mass of stars. It is the mind that breaks it into forms. Or why, looking down from a cliff upon the sea, do we isolate a wave and call it one? It is not isolated. No mortal could tell where it begins or leaves off. It is just a part of the sea. It is not one. It is millions and millions of drops. And even these millions are from moment to moment changing, moving. Why do we isolate it and call it one? There is some way of looking at things, some preconception already at work, in all cases which determines or helps to determine what we see and how we see it. All nature thus is broken and sorted by the mind, and as far as we can see, this is true of the simplest act of discrimination or sensation. The knower selects, supplies, ignores, compares, contributes something without which the discrimination or sensation would not be. Everyone has experienced the magic of the musician. Quote, that out of 3 sounds he frame not a 4th sound, but a star. The 3 first notes are mere sounds, noises, but with the 4th, the phrase, the melody, the meaning, suddenly descends upon us from within. An answer comes from the background of our minds, which transforms mere noise into music. Browning suggests that this magic is exceptional, but it is universal. All life is made of it. When the phrase or the melody have come to vibrate with meaning, then the concatenations of phrases and melodies roll up into the huge symphony, which now we call an inspiration, though once it too was only noise. So too the incidents, the events, the meanings of life roll up. The trees, the mountains, people's forms and features become luminous. Why do you see expressions, motives, emotions in folks' faces broad as day, which others never even suspect or imagine? The lines, the movements, are the same for everybody, but it is your mind that interprets. Always these knockings going on at the outer door of ourselves, and always something from within descending to answer, and ever new and newer answers as the years go on. Nor does it seem by any means sufficient to explain these answers in each case as merely the result of summations or associations of previous experiences, partly because of the very newness of the answer, as of the, quote, star in the music, or the expression on a loved one's face, things which, though they may be called forth by experience, are like no other experience. And partly because, as I have hinted, when we go back to the most primitive sensations, we seem to find the same thing. Buried in the self from the beginning are these affections. Browning indeed does not mention that exactly as the melody, though made of or provoked by 4 sounds, was utterly different from the 4 sounds or their summation, so each musical sound itself was a, quote, star in comparison to the air pulses that provoked it. Why should 270 taps in a second on the drum of the ear call forth the fairy C sharp from the hidden chambers within? Or so many billions on the retina, the magic and beautiful color of blue? We cannot resist the conclusion that the qualities of things, the bitter, the sweet, the rough, the smooth, the lovable, the hateful, the musical, the brilliant, are given already in the mind, though elicited by the outward phenomena, whatever they are, and that, allowing all we may for the gradual building up of knowledge from outside, and its gradual transformation, there remain nevertheless the forms under which we receive this knowledge. From the mere sensations of touch or taste or color or sound, up through the moral and mental qualities, to such things as the sense of self or of duty, and far beyond, which in a vast and ascending scale the ego, or hidden knower, contributes as its share to the solution of the marvelous problem. Having then cleared the ground somewhat by means of these 2 preliminary propositions, 1, that the self or ego may, provisionally, be thought of as existent in sleep or in an unmanifested condition, and 2, that it must be thought of as contributing the or a formative element in the knowledge which comes to it, we may proceed farther on the way. And first let us take, with respect to the nature of the self, the evidence of the 3rd stage of consciousness, such as we have it. We saw that in this 3rd stage the subject and object are seen, are known, to be united, to be essentially one. This is the unanimous declaration of the witnesses, and we know also that the witnesses are by no means few or insignificant in the history of the world. If then we accept their evidence, we must believe the final and real self to be the one and universal. For if A knows this essential identity with all objects, A, B, C, and C, and B also knows the same, then A and B know their essential identity with each other, even though they may never have seen each other, and so on. All our, quote, selves consequently must be one, or at least united, so as to be branches of the one, even though for a time deluded by the idea of separation. The ground of the universe must be one universal self, or one eternal city of selves, ever united and ever arriving at the knowledge of their union with each other. But since the evidence of the so-called cosmic consciousness is yet scattered and unauthoritative, and by no means universally accepted, we may, in the second place, consider what proof we may be able to get from the ordinary processes of thought and consciousness. And even by these we seem to be led towards the same conclusion, and to have the way up the higher slopes indicated, though of course the mule stops short at the edge. In fact, analyzing one's own mind, one of the first things that appears is that the ego underlies or accompanies every thought. It is always I know, I think, I feel, I remember, I desire, I act. Though some thoughts are moderately simple, and some exceedingly complex, though some take their color from others or derive a halo from the fringe of unobserved thoughts round them, still, inevitably, whether in the wholes or whether in the components, the ego is there, and we become convinced at last that if we could reach even the simplest and most elementary sensation of which we are capable, the ego would underlie, would be a part of the knowledge, even though not distinctly differentiated in consciousness. The ego, therefore, underlying my every possible thought, and even if I lived 1,000 years and shared the thoughts of all folk on the globe, it would still underlie them, and underlying, too, the most elementary sensation I can possibly conceive myself having, cannot be a thought itself. And so we are forced to think of the ego either as a kind of unitary being separate from all thought, which of course won't do, or else as an infinitely complex unity, capable of every conceivable thought, in fact, a universal being. But here, alas, we come to a fatal crevice beyond which the four-footed creature cannot go. For as soon as we think of the ego has already become a thought, and ceases to be the ego which we are in search of. Obviously, therefore, thought can be no more made use of in the matter, and the only course that remains seems to be to feel, as we instinctively do, that the ego is a unitary being, and to see that directly we try to think it. Its first form is that of an infinite complex capable of every conceivable thought, at the same moment acknowledging that in the act of thinking it, we have already departed from its essence. I shall now therefore assume, both on account of the direct evidence of the cosmic consciousness, and because the indirect evidence of the ordinary thought and consciousness points in the same direction, that there is a real universal self, a one absolute ego and knower, underlying all existences, the Tat Tvam Asi of the Upanishads, the essence and life of the whole universe, and true self of every creature. And I think we are justified in assuming this, because clearly the evidence of the ordinary consciousness, however long we work at the problem, can never carry us a step farther than it does now, while on the other hand, the direct evidence of the cosmic consciousness is added to by fresh witnesses every day, and daily becomes more conclusive. There is, therefore, I say, a real universal self, but there is also an elusive self. There are millions of selves, which are, or think themselves, separate, and over these we must delay. For to see the connection between them and the one self is greatly important, and we may be sure that the elusive self is not for nothing. Indeed, the term, quote, elusive, may not, after all, be quite the right one to apply to it. Let us ask two questions. 1. How can the great self also be millions of selves? 2. If the great self within each of us, and the ego of every thought, why do we not know it so? How can the great self also be millions of selves? Well, we may ask, how can the self of the human body also be millions of selves in the component cells of the body? For modern science more and more attributes selfness and intelligence to cells, and more tends to establish the intimate relation between the self of the body and the selves of the cells. How can a man be one self in his office, and another at his club, and another in his domestic circle? How is it that plants and low animals multiply by fission? Do the selves multiply? Or since a self is not necessarily to be thought of in space and time, can one self have many expressions in space and time, or many bodies? Or is it possible even that one self may require many bodies? Such are a few out of many questions that arise on the subject. The fact remains apparently, though we are not in a position yet to see all round it, that a self may become many selves, or that it may have many selves affiliated to it. In the human body, the cells are differentiated in a vast number of ways, according to their service and function in the body. The intelligence of each cell is an aspect or a differentiation of the intelligence of the body. The great self of the universe may differentiate itself into countless selves or, quote, aspects, and this may be a condition of more perfect self-knowledge. Yet each self or aspect may still be the whole, and commensurate with the whole. Quote, one eyesight does not countervail another, says Whitman. 10,000 people gathered round an arena may see one another and the whole show, each from his own point of view. Each onlooker sums up the whole, represents the whole, but each from a different side. Each eyesight is individual and complete, yet it does not interfere with any other. The fact is conceivable that the self may become countless selves. The great self is omnipresent in space and time. But if it appear or express itself at any one point of space and time, say as the ego of a single cell, then at once and in that moment it has determined an aspect of itself, and the ego in that cell is already an individual having within itself the potentiality of the whole, yet different from every other possible individual of the universe. The fact of such multiplex appearance in space and time is conceivable. The reason for it may be that of self-knowledge, but the quote, how of the operation must necessarily remain inscrutable to our ordinary thought. Leaving the matter thus, we may now then pass to other further questions. 2. If the great self is in each of us, and is the ego of every thought, why do we not know it so? And the answer is not difficult to frame. It is a question of degree, of expression. We only know that of which we perceive the reflection. Suppose the great self, now incarnate as the ego of a single cell, to receive some simple sensation, to exercise some most primitive and elementary act of knowledge. Then, from what has been said a few pages back, it cannot do that except because the knowledge is in some sense implicit in itself, and called forth by the outer phenomena, whatever that may be. There is a meeting of subject and object, a reflection of one in the other, a consciousness, but of very low degree. In the ego, all knowledge, so we are at liberty to suppose, is implicit. Yes, in the ego of that single cell. Universal knowledge as from that particular individual point of view. But that knowledge, though implicit, is not expressed. Only the lowest degree of it has come into consciousness. The ego, therefore, has only to that degree become conscious of itself. Perhaps the sense of touch has wakened within it, but no more. Certainly the consciousness of its own universal being, of its true self, has not been excited or called forth. As much of itself as has been reflected in the phenomenal world, it is conscious of with the order of consciousness that belongs to the phenomenal world, but no more. But presently another sensation comes along, or rather another happening which calls forth a sensation, say again, of touch. Many such touches may come, but still there is no particular growth of consciousness. But one day the sense of likeness between them arrives, and it arrives from within. Doubtless there may be a real outer relation of likeness between the touches, or the objects that cause them. But until the ego sees and seizes that relation, contributes it from within itself, there is no sense or perception of likeness for it. Thus now the ego of that cell has arrived at the degree of consciousness represented by the sensation or perception of likeness, and it has arrived there by the way of reflection in the objective world. It is clear that the ego, being already a more or less individualized aspect of the universal self, will see and seize, and group the happenings of the external world in some degree differently from any other individual. That is, its sensations and perceptions and inner qualities will develop and become manifest in consciousness according to its own law and order of exfoliation. The happenings of the external world will have their say certainly, and must not be minimized. They may retard or hasten the process. They may modify the outer embodiment, but it hardly appears that they can alter the general order of inner evolution. As experiences multiply for our imagined ego, at last a cluster of sensations, perceptions, latent associations, instincts, memories, thoughts, and feelings, fears, desires, wonderments, is formed about it and flowed around. These are all qualities of the ego, active as well as passive, called forth doubtless by the outer world, and used to give form and outline to its dealings with the outer world, but coming down from within. They are exfoliations or expressions of the ego. They are the ego coming to consciousness of itself, but within every one of them lurks still the fathomless being, and that which is unexpressed. This is the stage of animal consciousness, full of keen perceptions, sensations, instincts, and disclosing even higher powers of the mind. But still the thought of self is not there. It has not yet come to reflection, to consciousness. The cluster of thoughts around the ego has not yet been distinctly conceived as a separate cluster, separate from the rest of the world. There is no knowledge of the real self, none of the elusive self even. Yet the thought of self must arrive some time, to give a further unity to all experience. It must arrive, and from within, because the self is a reality, in a sense the only reality, and selfness must necessarily be one of the forms of its expression. But the mark of the individual self is its differentiation, its distinctness, even in some degree its separation from the others. And so we find that the first form in which the self fairly comes to consciousness is that of separation. One day, and this happens probably in the higher animals, certainly in the human child, the thought of me arises, and from that moment, a great new stage of evolution, of exfoliation has begun, the stage especially of humanity. Now, what is this thought of me? It is evidently another generalization, another form, which the ego at a certain stage projects, and classifies and colors the world therewith. Just as at one stage in human evolution the sense of melody came with the power of giving new meaning to an otherwise disconnected series of sounds, so at another stage the sense of me-ness comes, and throws a color and an associative bond over all the experiences of the ego. It is me, it is mine. All this manifold cluster of thoughts and feelings is now grouped and conceived of as myself, as me. And this is all right in a sense, for they are the expression, so far, of the great individual ego. But it is clear that here two mistakes are inevitable to occur. In the first place, the little cluster is almost certain to be mistaken for a kind of fixed and final me. It is looked upon as the real self, whereas at best it only represents the tiniest portion of the real self. It is, by the very act of being conceived, only an objectification of the reality, while the ego itself sinks fathomless behind. And in the second place, the me does not only appear as a complex of thoughts and feelings, representative of the ego, but is inevitably confused with the objects which excite those thoughts and feelings, which are the occasion of them, and in which they are reflected. Thus the body, the clothes, the goods, the possessions, are at first conceived as the me. They are me, they are mine. It is as a child who, first seeing his reflection in a glass, thinks the reflection is the real thing, and something inherent in the glass, and that special bit of glass. So the vast immortal ego finds itself reflected, and first becomes conscious of itself on this plane as the local and limited me, tangled apparently and bound in what are called material things. From all this arise two illusions, inevitable to this stage of self-consciousness, and full of sorrow and suffering to mankind. The I is thought of as perishable, and it is thought of as separate. It is thought of as separate because the me and the mine, that is, the conditions and surroundings which reflect the I, are in these early stages quite local and limited, and therefore as long as the I is confused with the me, the self must be thought of not only as different, but as isolated, separate, enclosed, and apart from the others. And it is thought of as perishable, because it is confused with the things of the outer world and the perishing flux of phenomena. But because, sitting on the bank of a stream, my reflections in the water wavers and shifts, that does not show that I am moving. Through a glass darkly we come at first to the knowledge of ourselves. For ages and ages the primitive man peered in ponds and streams, in bits of shining flint or metal or shell, and saw strange obscure visions, which he credited to these objects, nor knew or perceived that they were dim images of his own person. Or if he did guess that they were images, he thought that he himself, by some magic, was tangled in them. Only at last, and with greater experience, did it one day flash upon him that he was different, and by no means to be confused with streams and shells. Only at last did his true identity come to him. And only after long experience does the sense of our true identity come to us. And as the civilized man who has learned what reflection is, can now see his own face almost where he will, in pools and rivers and polished surfaces, nor thinks it only confined to some mystic shell or other object. So our true identity, once having been learned, our relation to our body having been completed, we shall find that the magic of one particular body is no longer necessary, since out of the great ocean of nature we can now pick up our own reflection, or make to ourselves a body of some kind, practically anywhere. So for a long time, the me goes on growing. Every new thought or experience that is added sinks into the me, and as long as the ruling idea of the me as a separate perishable entity governs the cluster or organism, so long do greed and fear, hatred and jealousy, sorrow and grief, increase and multiply and hover round, till their presence grows well nigh insupportable. Yet all the time the ego, the real self, is behind, waiting for its next development, its next expression, which must inevitably come. We have dealt much in similes. Let us return once more to the child regarding its own reflection, say, in the tiniest of tiny pools. So small is the little mirror that it only reflects the smallest part of the child, a lock of hair, a portion of its dress. The child does not in the least recognize what the reflection is, but it has a water can and pours water into the pool, and the pool grows. Now the child can see its own entire hand in the water. It is fascinated and tires not to pose its fingers in every way for reflection. But again the pool goes on growing, and more of its body becomes visible, till at last, lo, the child can see itself complete. So to us, each new thought, each new experience that is added to the me, is like a drop of water that is added to the pool, till it becomes large enough. The me becomes sufficiently universal to reflect the universality of the I. The vision of the true self at last arises, with wonder and revelation and joy indescribable. The vision of a self that is united to others, that is eternal. The thoughts connected with separation and mortality, the greeds, the fears, the hatreds, the griefs fall off, and a new world or conception of the world opens. Life is animated with a new spirit. The me conception, as far as that means isolation, mortality, self-seeking, disappears, is broken up, is transformed, and the life is transformed accordingly. When I say the idea of the true self arises, I do not say that at once the complete and final individual is realized. Nature does not proceed per salium. On the side of the past, there may yet be much clinging to the old self, and again, on the side of the future, there may be many new disclosures and revelations still to be made. But this stage, in which the human being begins at least to realize his universal life and identity, in which he, as it were, comes within sight of the end, forms such an epoch, that it may be taken as one of the great landmarks on his immense journey, a landmark more important even than that which signaled the birth of self-consciousness. It marks the entrance to an emancipated, glorified, transformed humanity, of whose further course and transformation we need not too curiously inquire, though we seem to discern dimly its grander lines. It marks the arrival of the third stage of consciousness, at first only occasionally and spasmodically realized, but even so guiding and pointing the way, and finally becoming permanent, not necessarily to obliterate and negate the earlier faculties, but rather to interpret and render them, for the first time, really rational and meaningful. It marks the realization at last of the whole meaning of the universe, even though the detail thereof may be forever inexhaustible. With a kind of inexorable logic, from infinitely various beginnings, from infinitely various sides, the great self sums itself up to form a vast affiliation of selves, a celestial city of equals and lovers. Quote, It is by love only that we can fully enter into that harmony with others which alone constitutes our own reality, and the reality of the universe. We conceive the universe as a spiritual whole, made up of individuals, who have no existence except as manifestations of the whole, as the whole, on the other hand, has no existence except as manifested in them. M. Taggart, The Further Determination of the Absolute.